Work and learn. Meet Light Meet Max සක්‍රිය කර ගැනීමට MySLT app එකට log වෙන්න. Work and learn. Meet Light Meet Max සක්‍රිය කර ගැනීමට MySLT app එකට log වෙන්න.
තියෙන ඇඳුම් වල අලුත් පෙනුම රැකගන්න. Comfort moody භාගයකින් කලක් පවතින අලුත් පෙනුමක්.
හරිම සුදුයි.
Tonight on First at 9, this Wednesday, the 11th of January 2023. Negative growth. World Bank expects global growth to decline to 1.7% this year. Sri Lanka's output to contract by 4.2% amid domestic vulnerabilities. Recovery measures. US-based Indian development economist Professor Jayati Ghosh to join us live to talk about measures essential for Sri Lanka to achieve debt relief sans austerity. Sanctioned. Sri Lanka's foreign minister summons Canadian envoy in Colombo over sanctions on 4 Sri Lankans, including former presidents Gotabaya Rajapaksa and Mahinda Rajapaksa, says human rights allegations unsubstantiated. Remain within mandate. Election returning officers should not be influenced by orders of any other authority other than the Commission itself or the judiciary, insists Chairman of Election Commission.
From AdaDerana, this is AdaDerana First at 9 with Ndivadi Amuata. Live from Studio 24 in Colombo.
And a warm welcome. We take you straight to your top story tonight. The World Bank expects Sri Lanka's output to contract again this year by 4.2%. In their report on global economic prospects, the global lenders said forecasts for 2023 growth has been revised down owing to the ongoing foreign currency shortages, the effects of higher inflation and policy measures designed to restore macroeconomic stability. The World Bank also expects the global growth to decline to 1.7% in 2023 from 3% expected just 6 months ago.
In World Bank's report on global economic prospects, they say the output in Sri Lanka is estimated to have fallen by 9.2% in 2022 as the government ran out of the foreign exchange needed to cover food and fuel imports and to service external debt. They say while the authorities are implementing a stabilization program, the country faces continuing shortages of food, energy and medical supplies. The World Bank points out that the food prices have risen rapidly in Sri Lanka and more than one-third of the population are food insecure, up from less than one-tenth in 2019. Although global food price inflation appears to have subsided, risks of increased deprivation and inadequate nutrition remain elevated. High fertilizer and petroleum prices are likely to affect upcoming planting seasons, increasing the persistence of high food prices and threatening households' ability to cope by depleting savings. The World Bank is of the view that the crisis and its repercussions have increased poverty and reversed much of the country's income gains over the past decade. They say that tourist arrivals, which is an important source of foreign exchange, continue to be depressed, with international arrivals last October about one-third of their 2019 level. What the global lender says is that Sri Lankan output is expected to contract again in 2023 by 4.2%. The forecast for growth in 2023, like the estimate for 2022, has been revised down owing to ongoing foreign currency shortages, the effects of high inflation, and policy measures designed to restore macroeconomic stability. Meanwhile, the World Bank says their latest forecasts indicate a sharp, long-lasting slowdown, with global growth declining to 1.7% in 2023 from 3% expected just 6 months ago. They say that the deterioration is broad-based, adding that in all regions of the world, per capita income growth will be slower than it was during the decade before COVID-19. The World Bank said the setback of global prosperity will likely persist, and by the end of 2024, GDP levels in emerging market and developing economies will be about 6% below the level expected on the eve of the pandemic. Median income levels, moreover, are being eroded significantly by inflation, currency depreciation, and underinvestment in people and the private sector.
Just yesterday, we saw a document that was signed by 200 scholars and economists world over, calling for debtors, Sri Lanka's multilateral as well as bilateral debtors, to share the burden of Sri Lanka's debt in terms of restructuring, with assurances of additional financing to the island nation as the country grapples with an economic crisis and awaits IMF's bailout package of $2.9 billion. I've invited to our studios to join us live now Indian origin development economist who's based in the United States, professor at the Department of Economics at the University of Massachusetts, Alhaz Jayati Ghosh. A very warm welcome to you, Professor.
Thank you.
Yes, so you would share the sentiment that Sri Lanka should be given adequate debt relief sans austerity measures. What does this really mean, Professor? We know we're talking to the IMF, the Sri Lankan authorities are engaging with the International Monetary Fund for $2.9 billion, but what's well known is that this comes with certain regulations and measures calling for the government to implement spending cuts. But when you say no austerity, what alternative do you propose?
Well, the problem is really this, is that the IMF is imposing measures or suggesting measures for a very, very small amount of money, less than 3 billion, when we know that the Sri Lankan total foreign debt is more than 50 billion, that its requirements for imports every year are in the range of about 10 billion. So this is a very small amount that will spread over 4 years or 3 years. Instead, in fact, we really have to think of what policies the countries that rule the IMF do when they are themselves in crisis. Whether it's the United States or the European Union or Japan, when they face crisis, they increase public spending. They don't decrease it. They run larger deficits. And they don't aim for fiscal balance in a period of downswing. The Sri Lankan economy has collapsed by 10% last year. 4.5% decline this year is an underestimate. If the IMF package is adopted, it will be an even larger decline, with much greater devastation, much greater suffering. What we have argued in our letter, the 182 economists who have signed this letter, is that, in fact, the Sri Lankan debt trap cannot be resolved without significant reduction of debt. And that means a reduction by all the creditors, bilateral, multilateral, and private creditors. At the moment, there is no major discussion of the reduction of private creditor debt at all. Bondholders are, in fact, planning to sue Sri Lanka to get the full value of their debt back. And yet, in fact, many of them, all the creditors really, are complicit in a strategy that involved, shall we say, not just corrupt governments taking on debt, but enabling a significant illicit financial flows over the last decade in particular, and encouraging the country to take on more debt to finance what was an unsustainable trajectory. So we are saying that those who were involved in a strategy that has turned out to be so disastrous must also bear some of the costs of that strategy, must also be willing to take a haircut.
Are you also suggesting some sort of debt forgiveness for Sri Lanka here? I'm just trying to make it clear.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. And this is, by the way, this is not something crazy or novel. This happens in all credit systems globally. Periodically, there are what are called debt restructurings for private credit debtors, for sure, within countries and externally. There have been many, many cases of debt restructuring. It's really quite common in most debt systems. When there's sovereign debt, we find that suddenly it becomes a big moral issue. It happens all the time with private debtors. We really have to enable this to happen with sovereign debt, especially when we know that a lot of it is effectively odious debt, that the people of Sri Lanka did not necessarily benefit from it, but also because it's clearly unsustainable. Sri Lanka cannot hope to repay this debt in full and achieve any kind of reasonable growth or basic living standards for its people in the near future.
But again, what's the implication of an IMF bailout package? Yes, this is the 17th occasion that Sri Lanka will work with the IMF for a bailout package. We're not new to this, but given the current crisis, what implications do you see?
I think that it's very concerning. As I mentioned, it's a very small amount. And what we already know of the likely conditions is extremely disturbing. They are asking for a fiscal surplus within a few years, which is, in fact, even by 2024, and a very large fiscal surplus by 2025. They are asking for better targeting and more efficient social subsidies and transfers, which really means a reduction in the availability of public services and a rise in price of basic things like electricity and fuel, which will cause all other prices to increase. They are asking for very strict limits on the government's ability to finance budget deficits using the central bank, which again is something that the US and European Union would never contemplate. They would always allow their own central banks to expand lending to the government whenever they require it. So these are very concerning, and you would have to undertake all of these conditions, which would actually make your growth much worse, make your possibilities of growth much worse, cause the economy to decline further, cause unemployment to increase, cause food poverty to increase for a very small amount, for 2.9 billion spread over a very long 4-year period.
Professor Ghosh, I'd like to also ask you this. Now, if debt cancellation offers Sri Lanka the only path to recovery, let's just put that aside. Sri Lankan authorities are forced to work with the IMF now, given this situation. Sri Lanka postponed, delayed going to the IMF, but now there are ongoing deliberations and discussions. Sri Lanka is looking for assurances from debtors, creditors, to give assurances in terms of restructuring Sri Lanka's debt. But at the same time, how do you forecast Sri Lanka's recovery, Sri Lanka's path to recovery with an IMF-supported program, regardless of the challenges you speak of?
It really depends hugely on the conditions. If the conditions are those which are being suggested in the media, then they will not help Sri Lanka recover. They will actually make matters worse. So really, those negotiating with the IMF need to emphasize that they cannot be asked to generate a fiscal surplus within a few years. They cannot be asked to rationalize what they're providing in terms of basic subsidies that ensure minimum goods and services. They have to be allowed to increase social spending. In other words, the kinds of conditions that the rich countries ensure for themselves, Sri Lanka must be willing to fight for those. Because the people of Sri Lanka have just undergone a very major upheaval. They have gone for protests that were admired the world over, peaceful protests that undid a government that was causing great harm to the country. But that should not go in vain. They should not then be subjugated once again by an economic strategy that does not help them.
Right, Professor Ghosh, I look forward to an in-depth discussion with you tomorrow at Hyde Park. But until then, thank you very much for your time here at Studio 24 live on AdaDerana English. We had with us Professor at the Department of Economics at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst Jati Ghosh, joining us. We'll be right back with more news on the other side of this break. Do stay with us.
It's hard to keep up with the new when you're listening to the same old Slim Bread Week. A week for professionals.
Welcome back to the news. The Canadian government imposed sanctions on 4 Sri Lankan state officials, including former presidents Gotabaya Rajapaksa and Mahinda Rajapaksa, over alleged human rights violations during the civil conflict. The sanctions will effectively freeze any asset that these 4 Sri Lankans may hold in Canada and render them inadmissible to Canada under the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act.
Recently, the Canadian government enacted special economic regulations on Sri Lanka in response to the former state officials responsible for committing gross and systemic violations of human rights. They also say that the Sri Lankan government has taken limited concrete action to address post-conflict accountability and reconciliation. As per the regulations, the Canadian government can impose a dealings prohibition and effective asset freeze on the persons listed. Accordingly, they imposed sanctions on Sri Lanka's former presidents Mahinda Rajapaksa and Gotabaya Rajapaksa over alleged gross and systematic violations of human rights during Sri Lanka's civil conflict. Further, Sanctions have also been imposed on 2 Sri Lankan military personnel, Staff Sergeant Sunil Ratnayaka and Lieutenant Commander Chandana Prasad Hettiarachchi. According to the Canadian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the special economic measures on Sri Lanka impose a prohibition on the listed persons on any transaction by prohibiting persons in Canada and Canadians outside Canada from engaging in any activity related to any property of these listed persons or providing financial or related services to them. The sanctioned 2 Sri Lankan former presidents and 2 military personnel are also rendered inadmissible to Canada under the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act.
Minister of Foreign Affairs Ali Sabri expressed the deep regret of the Sri Lankan government on the announcement of unilateral sanctions imposed against 4 Sri Lankans, including former Presidents Mahinda Rajapaksa and Gotabaya Rajapaksa. The Foreign Minister told the Canadian High Commission in Colombo, High Commissioner Daniel Blood, that the allegations levelled against the individuals are unsubstantiated. The Canadian High Commissioner was summoned to the Foreign Affairs Ministry today in order to officially express Sri Lanka's opposition to the Canadian government's move. Now, President Ranil Wickremesinghe discusses investment opportunities in Sri Lanka with the Japanese State Minister of the Cabinet Office, Satoshi Fujimaru. The discussion with the Japanese State Minister, who was accompanied by a Japanese business delegation, had taken place at the Presidential Secretariat this afternoon. The discussion on investment opportunities focused on investments into areas including hospitality and tourism, mining and training of Sri Lanka's workforce. The President explained that under the government's economic plans, emphasis was placed on training Sri Lanka's youth to ensure the country was geared to adapt a new and emerging industries. Well, the Election Commission says it will summon the Secretary to the Ministry of Public Affairs Administration and inquire about the letter issued by him directing all district secretaries to temporarily suspend accepting deposits for the local government election, which was later recalled. Addressing a media briefing today, he said the election returning officers are appointed by the Election Commission as per the Constitution and that they should not be influenced by the orders of any other authority other than the Commission or the judiciary.
Yesterday, the Secretary to the Ministry of Public Administration, Nil Bandara Hapuhina, issued a letter to all district secretaries instructing them to suspend accepting deposits from candidates for the upcoming local government election until further notice, pursuant to a decision taken by the Cabinet of Ministers. However, the Election Commission in a letter informed the district secretaries to accept election deposits since election returning officers are appointed by the Commission. The Election Commission noted that the election returning officers are also responsible to accept nominations between 18th of January and the 21st of January. Few hours after the issuance of the letter by the Public Administration Secretary, it was recalled yesterday. This afternoon, the matter was inquired from the chairman of the Election Commission at a media briefing.
රාජ්‍ය පරිපාලන ලේකම්තුමා ලියුමක් දිසාපතිවරුන්ට නිකුත් කරයි කියලා අපිට දැනගන්න ලැබුණා. නමුත් ඔහුම විසින් දැන් ඒ නිවේදන නිකුත් කළ අවස්ථාවෙන් වගේ පැය කිහිපයකින් මම හිතන්නේ ඉවත් කරගෙන තියෙනවා. කොහොම නමුත් ඔහු ඒ ගෙන්නලා ඒ පිළිබඳ විමසීමක් කිරීමට අපි කටයුතු කරනවා. මොකද ඒ සම්බන්ධයෙන් කියන්නේ තේරීම් බාර නිලධාරී පත් කරන්නේ ආණ්ඩුක ව්‍යවස්ථාව අනුව කොමිෂන් සභාව විසින්. ඒ කොමිෂන් සභාවේ ගැසට් නිවේදනයේ අපි පස් දෙනාම අත්සන් කරලා තමයි තේරීම් බාර නිලධාරී පත් කරලා තියෙන්නේ. ඒ පත් කරන් පස්සේ ඒ තේරීම් බාර නිලධාරීන්ට වෙන කිසිම බලාධිකාරියක් නැහැ. අධිකරණය හැරුණම ඔවුන්ට නියෝග උපදෙස් සහ වෙනත් කරුණු ඔවුන්ට නිකුත් කරන්න. මැතිවරණයේ කටයුතු සම්බන්ධයෙන්. ඒතර මැතිවරණ කටයුතු සම්බන්ධව පූර්ව වගකීම තියෙන ආණ්ඩුක ව්‍යවස්ථාව අනුව කොමිෂන් සභාවට නීතියානුකූලව මාර්තු 19 ඉස්සර සභා පිහිටවන්න ඕනේ. ඉතින් ඒතකොට මේ සභා පිහිටවන්න හැකි වෙන විදිහට ඡන්දය පැවැත්වීම කළ යුතුව තියෙනවා.
Taking you to the Colombo Stock Exchange, shares gained today after slipping for 4 sessions on the speculation of interest rates easing as T-bill auction yields fell for a second week straight. The main all-share price index closed at 0.16% higher at 8,308.87. The S&P SL20 index closed 0.17 lower to 2,560.95. Market turnover was 1.3 billion rupees, lower than this month's 2.1 billion rupee average daily turnover. Market saw a net foreign outflow of 12 million rupees. The net foreign inflow for the first 7 sessions of January is 80 million rupees. And we take a look at how the Sri Lankan rupee traded against other major currencies of the world today. And we'll be back with your world news on the other side of this break. But before that, oil prices were broadly steady today as market participants were pulled in different directions by an unexpected build in US crude and fuel inventories, global economic uncertainty, and China reopening its economy. Moving in and out of negative territory, Brent crude futures were up 53 cents or 0.7% at $80.63 a barrel, with US West Texas Intermediate crude futures rose 41 cents or 0.6% to $75.53 a barrel. Both contracts rose on Monday and Tuesday, rebounding from a sharp sell-off in the first week of 2023. US crude oil stockpiles jumped by 14.9 million barrels in the week ended January 6th. At the same time, distillate stocks rose by about 1.1 million barrels, although analysts polled by Reuters had expected crude stocks to fall. The oil market has been pulled lower by workers and worries that sharply higher interest rate hikes to the inflation would trigger a recession and curtail fuel demand. Well, that wraps up tonight's edition of First at 9 on AdaDerana 24. Thank you for tuning in. Do follow us on our social media for the very latest. I'm Indivadi Amuatta. Good night.
For news and information you can trust 24 hours a day, visit AdaDerana.lk.